we're going to finish with a very fun activity. As you can see, we've already gotten charted where we've come from here in terms of our ancestry story and our immigration story. And we're from all over the world. As you can look at that. We're from all over. The red is the primary, our primary ancestry group. So we have primaries from all over the world. Our blue is our secondary ancestry group. And then some of you had more than 2 predominant heritage as well. So then you would mark that with a green. You know, we heard that many people who did the ancestry test, you know, who thought that they were, whether it's Scandinavian or more British, but it turned out that they were more German than expected on their ancestry. And just thinking back to the time during World War I and World War II, and some of the views of German people at that time, you know, and we were wondering, did that affect how people identified themselves? If they had mixed heritage with German, would they prefer to say that they were one over the other, or would they prefer to say that they were Scandinavian or over Germany at all? It was an interesting question, and I thought about that a lot because it was very similar to my own ancestry story. Before going into taking the test, I thought that I was actually more Chinese than Cambodian, because my dad, I thought, was 100% Chinese, and he was actually a refugee from China into Cambodia, and then a refugee again out of Cambodia to America, here to New York. And then my grandfather, he knew that his grandmother was Chinese. At least he thought he knew that his grandmother was Chinese, because she wrote in Chinese, she said that she was from China. It turned out that my grandfather was not part Chinese at all. And that his grandmother was actually Vietnamese. And the reason why I knew that was because I did the test, the 23andMe test. My mother did it, and then my grandfather did it as well. And so we got the specific results back. And I was so curious about that I went to look into that a little bit more. Why was that confusion? And I would never bring this up to him, because I swear it might be the end of it if I were to tell him that he's not part Chinese, that he's part Vietnamese instead. And the reason that I found out with all the texts that I've been reading was that the animosity was so strong between Cambodians and Vietnamese, even prior to the Vietnam War, that when Vietnamese immigrants started moving down into the Cambodian area, they would call themselves Chinese. And this was before the French colonialization of Vietnam and everything like that, so that they were writing in Chinese characters still too. They shared a lot of ancestry with China. So she was saying to you know, she always told my grandfather that she was Chinese and not Vietnamese. So hence the surprise when it came out and he did his DNA test that he was a quarter Vietnamese and 75% Cambodian. So my predominant ancestry was, I was 41% Cambodian, about 35% Chinese, and about 11% Vietnamese. With my primary haplogroup, you know, with what Anne-Marie was talking about, coming out of Melanesia and southern China there. And it's really interesting to me as we look at our ancestry and we look at our immigration story. In our group here, I had Gordon in my group too, and we both have Asian ancestry. We are both immigrants here to the United States. The only difference is his father came as a working immigrant, and myself, I came as a refugee here. But being both Asian immigrant, being identified with the same stereotypes, and with some of the same, you know, cultural upbringings, we looked at our immigrant story very, very differently. You know, Gordon shared in the group that he kind of embraced some of the positive stereotypes, you know, of the Asian community, like being good at math and other things there. I told my group that actually the very first memory that I had when I was alive was a group of white teenagers riding their bikes right in our front yard, and they were making funny noises, pretending to be an Asian language. And then when they rode by me, they just spat in my face and rode off. You know, and I don't remember much from when I was 4 years old, but I remember that. I remember the anger that I had with that very incident. And it just made a lot of my focus, where I experienced a lot of positives and a lot of fun as a child too, but a lot of my memories were on those negative things that happened to me. You know, we didn't know much English, but every time I saw an interaction between my mother and we still call ourselves Cambodians at that time, because you know that was, you know, we spent most of our lives there, and also we didn't feel like we were allowed to call ourselves an American at the time. Every interaction between myself and an American, or between my mother and an American person, I always felt like my mother was being yelled at. And I always saw my mother looking down and walking away. And those images really sunk into my head and my personality. We, as kids then growing up in America, we kind of became lost. For some reason, we weren't Cambodian enough when we were at home. But then we went to school, for whatever reasons, we weren't Americans either. So we kind of formed our own family, and this family became a street gang, and we did a lot of other things that went into the narrative of what gangsters were. And I told my group there that, you know, being involved in it, I saw the positives that it brought me with having a family, with having someone to relate to. I had people, other kids that were going through some of the same struggles that I were going through. So we really formed that bond. But now looking back on it, when you see all your friends, you know, either being deported or being in jail, you know, you wish that there was a better story for you, for yourself there. I still even have the scars of when I was walking through the park and getting stabbed by a white supremacist, a group of white supremacist kids. So the interaction between myself as a Cambodian American, between my family as a Cambodian refugees, with other Americans at that time, was not very positive. And it didn't take me until I was 27 years old. I remember the exact date. I almost even remember the exact day when I felt like, this is my home too. I am an American. And really what really got me there, as I look back to it, was that I was pretty secure in my job as a teacher. I got my tenure, you know, I was making, now I know that teachers don't make a lot of money, but for that time I was like, whoa, I've never seen that much money roll into my checking account. I felt good, and I felt I was able to support my mother and myself, and I felt like I was in control of my life. And that was when I really felt like I am an American, and this is my home. So it was all that journey of ups and downs that got there it took me 27 years.
All right, so now we're just going to do a little journey of our history together. So the history of immigration, and then we talked about finding refuge, the journey of asylum seekers, home to the world, refugee resettlement, and then we're going to talk about who belongs here. So who was in our first class? A couple of you? Okay, so this chart was shown. It's kind of a diagram showing, I think I can do orange. On the left, it's 1600s, so the history of immigration started with British, Spanish, French, Dutch, Russians, and Africans. Then the 1700s was French Canadians and the French. 1800s is British, Irish, Germans, French, Russians, and then Mexicans. Then in the 1900s, we have Southeast Asian groups, Bosnian, the Serbs, Sudanese, Somalis, Mexican migrants, Central American groups, Chinese, and the Hong Kong Chinese. And then in the 2000s, we have Somalis, Karen, Tibetan, Chin, Tamang, Bhutanese, and Nepali. And then we talked about the different types of asylum seekers. We have A, B, C, D. We showed this diagram a few times. The first diagram being refugee resettlement process, so coming to the US border.
So B is the affirmative asylum. Those are the ones that are arriving to our, they enter on a valid visa. So they have a visa to come in here to the United States for asylum. So the B is the people who there's trouble brewing in the country. Maybe they're former soldiers in the country, like during the Vietnam War. A lot of the Vietnamese soldiers, the Cambodian soldiers, or the people who were married to American soldiers then would have a valid visa to come in here to America, and they can't go back to their country because their country is at war or in conflict.
And then C would be the asylum seekers that sought asylum coming to the country because their country was in conflict. And then D, which is the least amount, but that would be the asylum, or the defensive asylum process, where they do not request asylum.
Yeah, those are the ones that they come here on a tourist visa or something else. So they're not requesting asylum beforehand, or they didn't come to our border requesting asylum, but they've come here and then they've stayed for a little while, but then something happened in their country and then they don't go back. It's a little bit different from B, where B, you know that there's a conflict in your country and you're coming in because of the conflict. For D, you're coming in on a tourist visa. Your country was safe during the time that when you came here, but then something happened, or you're just aware of the situation now, and then you apply to stay here instead of going back.
And then we also went over this chart. It was the number of refugees resettled in the US, and it falls below the total. So the green is the United States, and the blue is all other countries. So if you can look at the end right here, the right, 2017, all other countries is up at 69, and the US is down at 33.
So prior to talking about this slide here, I just want to go back to the beginning here. Now we talked about asylum seekers, we talked about refugees, and we talked about our immigration throughout time here. There is another significant category that we did not get to touch on in this series here, and it's just only been a new term that has come up now, and that's imported people. And actually that's the term that's given to a lot of the African slaves that were brought in during the era of colonialism here. And just like you see with asylum seekers, with refugees, and with immigrants, there's a different story to their immigration. And also there's a different perspective to their immigration too. And that's the same for a lot of our African American heritage who can trace their lineage back to the time of slavery, because they were brought here against their will. They didn't come here as immigrants, they didn't flee any danger or anything like that. They were brought here and sold here, just like produce and imports. And that adds another element to the immigration story. That is something that I'm just studying about right now, so maybe it's a series in the future that we look into. So before immigration happened, there was already people living here, and I'm no expert in this category at all, but as you can see, there are many native tribes that are already here already. And in Minnesota here, it was predominantly the Ojibwe and the Dakota people that were here, and those were the boundaries back then. In my minimal research I did, this was the interesting piece here, was all the little land and territory that were being chipped away from our native people at the time. The Dakota treaties were on the left here, and then the Ojibwe treaties were on the right there. But this land of Minnesota here did not belong to the settlers, did not belong to the European explorers. They came in and originally asked to explore some of the areas in the Minneapolis-St. Paul, some of the minerals in the Minneapolis-St. Paul areas. And that led to the first treaty there in 1826. The Fond du Lac Mining Treaty establishes the right to search for minerals in the area. We did have a trading post earlier before that in 1805, Fort Snelling. there, and the Dakota ceded the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. But I've emailed this to some of the participants there, the ones that I had emails to. But what I found interesting in all this here was that at that time, as we were moving west, we took over bits and pieces of land and said that, oh, we'll give you this area here. Areas that weren't us, for us to give in the first place. But we gave them that area, then later on we wanted that area, then we moved them out again. The most interesting story that I learned was in that little pink strip of land there from 1860 to 1863 that involved the Dakota. There were numerous treaties that involved the Minnesota River area there. First, we came in and then we took all the land south of the Minnesota River, and we forced the Dakota people north of the Minnesota River. And then we wanted the northern area, and then we forced them in a smaller strip of land south of the Minnesota River. And then finally we gave them that little strip of land just around the Minnesota River there, for the Dakota people. And at the end of the whole thing, from both the Dakota and for our Dakotas and our Ojibwe people, we decided to say that, we want all of Minnesota, and we're going to move all of you to the White Earth Reservation. So we thought, or at least the settlers, I say we because I feel like that this history belongs to me as well now, as with my journey now and saying that I am an American as well, that I share this history here. But at that time, there was that thinking that we belonged here, more importantly than even the native people that were there. So as we see our maps here, as we talk about immigration throughout our time here, the majority of us, unless we do have Native American ancestry, we're all foreign to this land here. Which brings us to that conclusion. If we were all foreign to this land, and whether it was our direct ancestors or not our direct ancestors, we've all had this history of immigration, this history of struggle, this history of battles and fighting, to carve out a place for ourselves here. So with that understanding, who does this land belong to? Who belongs here?
The Indians.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our series here, and our goal with the whole thing was to never just preach a message to you guys. We were hoping that you bring different points of view and share in conversation. So we've hoped that we've accomplished our goal, and we hope that you guys enjoy your time with us here. Thank you.